Hey, this is Pastor Jay Lee, and you're listening to the Daily Sabbath Podcast. Hey guys, Pastor Jay here. Welcome to the Daily Sabbath Podcast. And it is that time of the week again. It's time for our questions episode of the week. And I'm not going to lie, today we've got kind of a tricky one for you. It's sort of low-key tricky. We're talking about, is the Old Testament still relevant to us today? Right? And is all of it still relevant, or maybe just parts of it are still relevant? And if so, which parts? How do we decide? Right? And so it's kind of one of those tricky questions where the more you actually start to think about it, the more questions it raises. My special guest today is Bert Newton. He is a fellow Christian podcaster as well as an author. And he is also the owner of maybe the sweetest podcasting voice I've ever heard. I mean, I could listen to Bert talk about anything and I would probably enjoy it. And so get ready to have your ear canals massaged by Bert's soothing voice. But without further ado, here is my interview with Bert Newton on the relevance of the Old Testament today. Okay, so the question that we're talking about is, does the Old Testament still apply to us today? And so, I think this is a question where believers have really a range of interpretations and a range of perspectives. There are some who feel that there's a reason why we call it old, and it really doesn't have anything to say to us today, that portion of the scriptures is completed. And so we really don't need to spend too much time studying it. And there are some who maybe see the Old Testament as still having value, but really just as figurative and symbols that all point to Christ and the coming of Christ. And so maybe in every single passage they look at in the Old Testament, they find some sort of symbol or metaphor that symbolizes Jesus and the cross in some way. And so there's a range of ideas. And so I think this is a question that, can hinder some believers as they approach the scriptures and approach specifically the Old Testament and studying it and, what value it has in their relationship with God, what value it has for them in their devotional life. And so today, my guest is Bert Newton. He is an author who published a book called Subversive Wisdom: Socio-Political Dimensions of John's Gospel. He is also the host of a podcast, Bible Study, Parody and Subversion in Matthew's Gospel. He has a master's in divinity from Fuller Theological Seminary. He's also ordained through Pacific Southwest Mennonite Conference, and he's a ministry associate at Pasadena Mennonite Church. And if that isn't enough, he also works for a faith-based nonprofit promoting affordable housing. And so, Bert, thank you so much for taking time to be on the podcast.
Thank you, Jay. It's an honor.
Yeah. And so the way that I have kind of come into contact with Bert is I have been following his podcast, Bible Study, Parody and Subversion in Matthew's Gospel. And so in my small group, we've actually been studying through the Gospel of Mark. But, as you know, there's a lot of passages that are, similar in Matthew and in Mark. And so, honestly, Bert, your podcast has become our commentary for studying through the Gospels. And basically, anytime we've come to a passage where we don't understand it or we don't understand the significance of it, we basically default to your podcast. And so, I just really appreciate just the depth of research and just how you bring to life the historical and the cultural context that maybe we're not totally in tune with here, in our modern day. And so really appreciate the richness and the depth of that podcast. And so when I was thinking, okay, who can we bring in to bring some insight on this question about, the relevance of the Old Testament to us today, I felt like, we need to get somebody in here who's kind of a little bit more of a scholar. And so you were the first person that came to mind for me. And so just really appreciate that you can kind of bring some of that depth of research and scholarship to the question.
Well, thank you, Jay. That's quite an honor. I'm glad it's useful.
Yeah. So if anybody out there is doing a study in the book of Matthew, I highly encourage you to check out that podcast, as well as if you're doing a study in the book of John, that he has published that book and it's available on Amazon. Okay, so let's jump into the first question. So like I was mentioning in the intro, there's sort of a range of opinions on how Christians are approaching the Old Testament, or, you could call it the Hebrew Scriptures, might be a better term to use for it. But I think, yeah, for some people, they pretty much just kind of lay it to the wayside. The Old Testament is really not relevant to us anymore. We have the New Testament. Jesus has come. The Old Testament has been fulfilled. And so it's really not useful to us at all. While others are, maybe they see some value in it. I think what we can say is there is confusion about whether or not it still applies, and if so, how. And so I guess the first question is just the basic question. Is the Old Testament still important for us to study and know today?
I would say yes, it is. And I'm glad you talked about how we refer to it. I try not to refer to it as the Old Testament. Sometimes I'll say the Older Testament because it is older. But a lot of times I'll say the Hebrew Scriptures. In my podcast, and this will be relevant for how I answer this question, I often will just refer to the literature of ancient Israel. And of course, that's actually bigger than just what we call the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. There's other documents that did not make it into that canon. But as a background for understanding the New Testament, this ancient Israelite literature is extremely, extremely important in order to understand what's going on. I mean, for me, my faith is rooted in the gospel story, in the story of Jesus. But you really can't understand it unless you understand it in its historical context, in its cultural context, in its literary context. And so the Hebrew Scriptures, the Older Testament, it's much of the literary background of the New Testament. It's not the only literary background. There are, as I mentioned earlier, there are texts outside of the Bible that also form some of the literary background. There are Greco-Roman texts, so texts from outside of Judaism and Christianity that help us understand what's going on. That's more culturally. They help us understand or help us with like phrases and how certain phrases were being used or whatever. So to help us understand. But the texts that are actually in our Bible, they're the ones that really form a background because a lot of times the New Testament is referring to them. Now, most readers are familiar with the New Testament making obvious, like overt references to the Older Testament. And Matthew, which is what my podcast is on, Matthew is foremost among the books that makes overt references to the Older Testament. But, and this is true in Matthew as well as elsewhere, there are a lot of times when it's being referred to that it doesn't say specifically we're referring to it. It just, but the original reader would have understood because the original Jewish audience, a lot of people wouldn't have been reading it; they would have been hearing it as one person read it. They would catch the references that we don't catch, and sometimes it's just a word or phrase that they're using. I'll give you a modern example. Like today, for a lot of people born in the United States and that are, say, over, I don't know what age. I'm over 50 now. I know people in my generation. If you said on the grassy knoll, a lot of people would know that you are referring to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So there are things like there are ways in which I'll give you one example. This is in the Gospel of Matthew. There's a point at which they're crossing the Sea of Galilee, and there's a storm, and Jesus is asleep, and they have to go wake him up. Now, to us, that's just another story. However, to the original audience, steeped in the Hebrew Scriptures, they're going to realize that's riffing off of the story of Jonah. Jonah was asleep in a boat crossing the sea with a big storm, and they had to go wake him up. So it's riffing off of the story of Jonah. And then you realize, for those of us who are reading through Matthew, that the story of Jonah is elsewhere in that gospel referred to twice. The story of Jonah is a major theme in the Gospel of Matthew. But we normally would miss that. And that's one that a lot of us Christians who are somewhat familiar with the Older Testament would know. There's a lot of other things that we wouldn't know. Here's an example that we wouldn't pick up unless we were really, really steeped. And that's when Jesus says, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. So first you have to know that it can be translated, blessed are the poor, for they will inherit the land, that the Greek would allow for that. But once you know that, you still might not realize, unless you're steeped in the Hebrew Scriptures, that Jesus is riffing off of Psalm 37:11, which says, "The poor will inherit the land." So there's all these references that are not overt. The author of the gospel doesn't tell you that he's riffing off of the Older Testament. The Exodus story is referenced over and over and over. The Gospels are presented. This is not just Matthew. This is all four of them. They're presented as a second Exodus. Jesus is a second Moses, and there's all these times that is referenced. Just every time there's the crossing of a sea, there are ways in which the author of the Gospel lets us know that he's thinking of the crossing of the Red Sea by the Israelites out of Egypt. So there's all these literary reasons. And then there's the portrayal of Jesus as a teacher or as a rabbi. And this is something that scholarship has been moving toward in the last few decades, is to really understand that Jesus is being portrayed in the Gospels and in our New Testament as a rabbi who is not only faithful to the Israelite law, the Torah, but is a champion of it and is very steeped in the knowledge of it. More and more scholars are seeing that Jesus' arguments are actually based in the law. Now that may be a little difficult for us to see sometimes, because it seems sometimes that Jesus is disagreeing with the Torah. And it's sort of yes and no. Rhetorically, he's always agreeing with it. But we might, at least from modern Western logic, we might see it as a disagreement. So an example of this is divorce. So the Torah made a way for men to divorce their wives. When Jesus is asked about it, he says, no, you cannot do that. Except in Matthew says it's except in the case of marital infidelity. And so it looks to us like he's contradicting. But the way he says it, he says, no, in fact, don't even look at a woman lustfully. And when you understand, if you know anything about rabbinic rhetoric, then there's this thing called building a fence around the Torah. It's where you don't want to transgress the law, so you build a fence around it, and you do more than the law requires, so you don't even come close to transgressing the law. And that's what Jesus is doing. He's saying, not only is marriage sacrosanct, don't even look at a woman lustfully. This is all said to men. Don't even look at a woman lustfully. So he's building a fence around. He's protecting the institution of marriage that is in the Torah. So he is like taking us a step further. So in rabbinic debate, that would be being faithful to the law, not disagreeing with it. So in the West, we would think it's a disagreement, but in the rabbinic debate, they would see that as, they understand what he's doing rhetorically. He's actually protecting the law to a much greater degree.
So like sometimes we kind of in our Western mindset, we see Jesus as sort of combating the law, combating, these antiquated Hebrew scriptures. But in reality, he's very much in sync with kind of the practice of the rabbis and the practice of sort of debating the law. And he's not necessarily disagreeing with it, I think you're saying, but he is actually giving what he believes to be a clearer understanding and a better interpretation of the law. Exactly.
And that's what rabbis would do. They would constantly debate with each other. If you've ever read any of the Talmud, a lot of the Talmud is just this ongoing debate among the rabbis on how to interpret the law. None of them see themselves as disagreeing with the law. They do interpret it in ways that you might think they're disagreeing with the law, or you might think they're nullifying part of it. But it's just an ongoing debate about the law. But it's not in the sense of, it's just wrong. It's in the sense of we're moving forward and we're debating these laws. It's a lot like it would be done in our courtrooms today, where everybody's being faithful to the law, doing their best to push forward a particular argument. But everybody sees themselves as faithful to the law. And that's why Jesus, what he's doing, and he's got a particular way of interpreting the law. And what I argue on my podcast is that his way of interpreting the law is to make it easier and less onerous on the common person, especially for the poor, because many people in Jesus' day were destitute.
Yeah.
So if you so that's why he accuses the scribes and the Pharisees of placing a heavy burden on other people with the law. It's not that you shouldn't apply the law, it's just that you should interpret it in a way like he does that makes it more accessible. And in Jesus' rhetoric and his teaching, his interpretation is faithful to the law, and it makes it easier for the common person.
Okay, so then I think what I hear you saying then as a great starting point to this question is that we need to know the Hebrew scriptures really to understand the New Testament and understand the Gospels more fully. And that if we don't have that foundation and that background, there's a lot in the New Testament that maybe we're going to miss, or is maybe even going to be incomprehensible to us.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's exactly the case, because we've lost so much. I mean, this is, the New Testament. We call it new, but it was written almost 2,000 years ago in another language, in another culture that's very different from ours. And so we tend to read it like it was written yesterday in English. And therefore we lose a lot. So just even knowing the Older Testament well will bring us a long way to understanding the New Testament.
Yeah. And I think, when we were speaking about this previously, you mentioned that, we have to remember that the Hebrew scriptures was Jesus's Bible, right?
Yes.
And so you mentioned that in a conversation we had previously, and I thought that was a great point. And another thing that I just kind of thought of as you were talking about this is that, there's kind of that scientific concept of triangulation, right? That when you have multiple points of reference, that it can help kind of narrow in on something. And so, we are standing at a distance historically from the New Testament, and we're trying to make sure that we're understanding the New Testament properly. And when we have this other data point, right, the Old Testament, that can help us triangulate sort of the meaning of Jesus's words of the gospel. And so, just what you were saying there kind of made me think of that imagery.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought about thinking of it that way. Yeah, when we realize, we have another. You must have a science background. I've never.
No, just nerdy, I guess.
But yeah, no, that's a good point. Once you understand it against a certain backdrop, then it suddenly that the meaning can shift and change and become much deeper. So the Older Testament is part of that. The other parts are trying, if you understand, Middle Eastern culture and also the history of what's going on at the time. Those are other backdrops that you need to really understand what's going on. But the Older Testament definitely it's another, like you said, another data point, and it becomes, I have to say, it becomes a lot more interesting and a lot more profound.
All right, so now kind of moving on from that question, I want to kind of focus in on a specific part of the Hebrew scriptures, which is specifically the laws, right? Because I think that's another question that a lot of believers have is, the specific portions of law, do those still apply to believers today? And if so, in what way? Do they completely apply to us and we should be following those laws? Maybe they don't apply to us at all today and we should completely disregard them. Maybe some, but not others. And if so, how do we decide which ones apply and which ones don't? And so, I just wanted to kind of throw that at you, which I think is also kind of a difficult question. But do you have any thoughts on, what of those specific laws still apply, if any?
Yeah, that's a good question. And obviously, whole denominations have sprung up on how they stake out the answer to this question. And actually, the New Testament gives us the answer. The New Testament, which was written either almost entirely or entirely by Jews who were following Jesus, they had to wrestle with this. Jesus in the Gospels makes clear that the movement is going to be transnational. It's not going to be just within Israel. It's not just to revive Israel, but it's a universal message for the world. and it's going to be transnational. So we see as these followers of Jesus start encountering Gentiles more and more, what do they do with this? And so Paul, of course, is the big missionary to the Gentiles, right? So he has to figure things out. And, so he writes a lot about how circumcision, that Gentiles do not have to be circumcised, and not physically. And then he even comes up with this metaphor that true circumcision is circumcision of the heart. So that's a much more universal. He takes something that's specific for Jews and makes it universal, where people of other cultures don't have to be circumcised. And so this ends up with a council in Jerusalem where they wrestle with this. And it's kind of interesting wrestling. You can see that they themselves don't have clear answers. First of all, they have disagreements with each other, and they have to have a council around it. And then they finally decide that as long as people don't eat food polluted by idols, they don't engage in sexual immorality, and they don't eat the meat of strangled animals or drink blood. As long as they don't do that, then they're good. They don't have to, follow the rest of the specific laws. Israel was a specific country. It was a specific nation with a specific law code. And so we are heirs of the wisdom of that nation, but we are not Jewish ourselves. And so this is what Paul and the Jerusalem Council, this is what they were realizing, that the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven, it was going to be sort of what I call it in my podcast is a new society. This new society comes out of Israel, but is not actually Israel. And it's not about cultural domination. That Israel has to culturally dominate everyone else and convert everybody else culturally. It's the deeper wisdom of universal truths and justice have come to us through Israel. That is what is to be applied universally. So I think we can both value the Older Testament and study it, to know it as a background for the New Testament. But we don't have to think that we have to abide by all those laws, because the Jerusalem Council, back in Acts,
we have a precedent,
already said no. Yeah, they said we don't have to.
So basically, the laws, they apply specifically to the nation of Israel living in the Promised Land.
Exactly.
So, one analogy that I've heard someone use, and you can tell me whether or not you feel like this is a good analogy or not, but they kind of compare Israel's laws in the Old Testament as sort of their constitution. And so just like we here in the U.S., we have the Constitution, and that sort of governs us here in the U.S., and our laws are based on it, that the laws of Torah were their constitution. And so we don't live under that law because we're not Israel living in the land of Israel.
Exactly. No, I've used that before. The Constitution. It doesn't look exactly like ours because it's a different culture, a different time. But yeah, that's the case. And even like our Constitution got amended, like after the Civil War, then the slavery parts were nullified. That actually happens within the Torah itself. Deuteronomy means second law. That's what it means. And it's a retelling of the original laws that were in Exodus, but some of them get changed a little bit. They're updated. So even within the Bible itself, there's this sense that it's a real law. These aren't just sort of sacred spiritual principles. This is a real law for a specific time, and as the situation changes, they update the law. It happens within Torah itself. So I think that analogy is really good because it helps us to understand that the law wasn't theoretical. It was practical for a specific time and place. And that's why the Jerusalem Council, there's a struggle for them to kind of break out of their own context. But they do it. And they're able to say, those laws were for our people. We want to share this, the wisdom of our tradition, and we want to especially share the wisdom of Jesus with the world, but they don't have to become. They're not in our country.
Yeah, yeah. So I like the way that you put that. So what we're looking for then from the laws is not to necessarily obey them because they don't really truly apply to us anymore, but we're looking for the wisdom in them, the timeless wisdom in them, and the principles and kind of what they reveal to us about God and His desire, His heart, and so that's really what we're looking for out of it.
Yeah, and I use the term wisdom partly because people tend to understand that as a more profound idea, but it's also universal, but also because there's a whole wisdom tradition from ancient Israel. So there are books that are referred to as the wisdom books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and so there's this whole wisdom tradition that was more. It wasn't about laws. That was more about principles, and that were more universal. And that was the part of their tradition that was more international. And Jesus is portrayed in the Gospels as a wisdom teacher, as a rabbi, as a sage. At one point, he says, wisdom is vindicated by all her children. And he's referring to himself and John the Baptist. So Jesus is a child of wisdom. Jesus is wisdom. In the book of John, especially, this happens in Matthew too, but in the book of John, the portrayal of Jesus is very different than in the other three Gospels. And a big reason for that is that Jesus is being portrayed as the incarnation of wisdom. We see this a little bit in Matthew, but in John, Jesus starts speaking and acting like Lady Wisdom of Proverbs. If you ever read through Proverbs, wisdom becomes personified as a woman. It's the wisdom of God, but wisdom is personified as a woman walking the streets, calling out to people, learn from me, learn from me. That's how Jesus is portrayed in the Gospel of John.
Interesting.
He often calls out. So it's very different. He says, learn from me, eat my bread, drink my wine. That's what Jesus says in John. Lady Wisdom says that in Proverbs. She says, eat my bread, drink my wine. So Jesus as a child of wisdom, as the personification of wisdom, as a wisdom teacher, is a major theme in the Gospels. So the laws are important, but it's the wisdom that comes out of them.
Yeah, and you explore that aspect more in your book, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. In the one in John, especially, I get into that. The book is called Subversive Wisdom. You mentioned it earlier. Subversive Wisdom, Socio-Political Dimensions of John's Gospel. And so that's a major thing I'd bring out. It's a very, very short book, but I do get into that.
Okay, so I mean, if you're listening to this and you want to explore that theme a little bit more, make sure you check out Bert's book. Okay, so last question. What do you think are some things that people tend to get wrong or tend to miss in the Hebrew Scriptures? Obviously we have these questions about whether or not it applies and things like that, but just going to the text itself, what do you think are some important things in there, important themes or whatever, that you feel like people tend to miss about the Old Testament?
Yeah, I think kind of going back to that, the Older Testament is the canon of an ancient nation, one out of which God has spoken to us, but it's a particular nation, and yet there is ancient wisdom there. And then there are things that, because we live, I think, in a highly individualistic society and in a capitalist society where things are, I guess, private ownership is held sacrosanct, and individual wealth, I think, is more guarded and in our society. But in the context in which the Older Testament was written, it was written in a nation in which it wasn't as individualistic, and there was more of a sense of the community is what is important. And so we get, like Leviticus 25:23 says, the land shall not be sold in perpetuity. This is God speaking. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. With me you are but aliens and tenants. And there is some really, really deep wisdom in that I think would be hard for some people, at least some people might love it, but for some people in the U.S., in the modern United States, would have a hard time with that. I saw some sociologists, or listened to some sociologists recently that had done a study on different cultures around the world and through time, and cited that the U.S. is the most individualistic society the world has ever seen. Like, so we are a real outlier. But ancient Israel would have been, at least historically, more typical. And so there's this idea that God owns the land. And this is actually a refrain that's said over and over throughout the Hebrew scriptures. It's usually, usually gets translated, the earth is the Lord's, or something like that. But the word for earth, is the Hebrew word eretz, it usually elsewhere is translated land. And in Leviticus 25:23, it's land. God owns the land. You could translate it, God owns the earth, but then you have to deal with the first part. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. So it's more often translated land. So it's this idea that humans don't own the land in any ultimate sense, that God owns the land. And all of us are merely tenants on God's land. Now we inherited a lot from the Bible in our culture, but we also inherited from other cultures, specifically Rome. Rome, we have Latin on our coins. We have Roman architecture in Washington, D.C., and a lot of our law was based on Roman law. And in Roman law, someone could own the land absolutely, but not in Israelite law. In Israelite law, the idea was that God owns the land. The rest of us are tenants on it. And if we understood that, then that could go a long way toward solving a lot of problems in our society, where people end up homeless. Just land rights and how we think of land, and does someone. So there's a lot of time spent in our courts arguing about who owns the land and who has what rights. But if we thought of it as common ownership, that for the common good, then I think we would make a lot better choices. So, so I think that's the Older Testament. I think if we look at it, we can. Well, we aren't going to apply those specific laws, but that wisdom of the common good and common ownership. We look at the manna story, which so the Exodus story is a big, major story in the Older Testament, right? And it not only gets used a lot in the Gospels, if you realize how often it's being referred to, it also gets repeated in other parts of the Older Testament. I mean, the prophets keep referring back to the Exodus over and over again. And the manna story in the Exodus is one in which God provides for everyone according to need. People don't have to earn manna. It says when they go out and collect it, no matter how much they collected, everyone had just what they needed. Some collected more, some collected less, but when they measured it, everybody had 1 omer per person in their tent. They got exactly what they needed. So even if you can try to get out a little early and out hustle your neighbor in the neighboring tent, it didn't work. You just ended up with the manna that you needed. And so, that's a story that we just really have not taken to heart in our society, that not everything has to be competitive. And not everything has to be commodified. That there are certain basic needs that we can say people will not go hungry in our society. We take care of each other. So I think that deep wisdom is there. And so I think especially as a Western capitalist culture, we can learn from ancient Israel that we are our brother and sister's keeper. That we should be taking care of each other. We don't have to tell everyone they have to earn their right to be alive. But, so I think that's a deep wisdom that the Older Testament has. And that's there in the New Testament as well, of course.
But maybe we don't recognize it in the Hebrew scriptures as clearly. Yeah. And, just for those of you guys who are listening, I mean, this is more than just theoretical for you, right? As I mentioned at the beginning of the interview, part of your work is you work for a nonprofit that works on the issues of affordable housing, right? And so, it sounds like for you, I mean, you've directly been able to apply this wisdom that you see coming out of the Hebrew scriptures, just like what you're saying, and it has made an impact on what you're doing with your life and the work that you've decided to engage in. Do you want to kind of mention a little bit more about that work?
Absolutely, yeah. No, and this is not theoretical for me at all. I don't always live up to what I see in the gospel or in the Bible, but it has directed my journey. And so right now I'm working for an organization where it's called Making Housing and Community Happen. We are faith-based. Technically or officially we are interfaith, but most of our churches are Christian churches. And so most of our theological work, almost all of it, has been in the Bible, has been biblical work. And so, and by the way, when I go into churches and talk about this, I generally get a very good reception. I've never had anybody get angry or reject it. People tend to say that it's good news to hear that we can care about other people. Like, we always knew that was right, but now we know that the Bible is actually telling us to do that. And to care about justice in society, not just me caring about one other person or doing service work, but actually establishing justice in society, that the Bible actually cares about that. And yeah, so one of the texts that we use is Leviticus 25:23. There are a number of others, but because that one talks about how God owns the land, and we ask, what if we really believe that? Then what could we do? How could that change the way we think about housing and homelessness and affordable housing? Because I live in a city where the housing prices are out of control, and people are being displaced. The African American community, I live in Pasadena, California. The African American community has been, I know between 2000 and 2010, it shrunk by almost 25%. And if you go back 25 years, we don't have the figures for 2020 yet. We're still waiting for those to come in for the last 10 years. But I think if you go back like to 1995 to now, I wouldn't be surprised if you found that the African American community in our city has been cut by 50%. I think there's good evidence for that now. So people are being displaced. People are homeless in our society. So we are going to churches. We are going to a city council. Most, if not all, of our city council members are Christians. And I think you're going to find that's not a rare thing. You'll probably find that on most city councils. And we appeal to them out of the Bible. I've stood up and testified at city council meetings quoting Isaiah. We've quoted Jesus. So yeah, I think the texts from the Bible are powerful, and they sometimes cut against the grain of our own cultural assumptions. Because American culture tends to be, there are many good things about America. I love my country, but it tends to be a highly individualist, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and ignore all the help you got from someone else, because everybody has been helped by other people.
No one has truly pulled themselves up only by their own bootstraps.
No, not at all. But we tend to ignore the privilege that we have. So I'm a white heterosexual male American citizen. I have plenty of privilege, and a lot of people like me are ignoring that privilege and saying they did it all themselves. No one did it all themselves. And the Bible reminds us of that. The Bible reminds us that we are here to take care of each other and establish justice in society.
Yeah. I mean, that's just such a powerful point. And, kind of going back to something I had said earlier that, of course, there's some people who just feel like, oh, the Old Testament's not relevant, let's just disregard it. But there are others who, I think, well-intentioned, they take sort of a Christological lens to the Old Testament, which, I mean, obviously that's never a bad thing. But basically, they're exclusively looking at the Hebrew Scriptures, looking for like, okay, what are the things that point to Jesus, and what are the things that are prophetic, or what are the things that maybe have some symbolism. But, I think it's important to acknowledge that if that's the only lens that we take to the Hebrew Scriptures, that we may be missing exactly what you're talking about, that beyond that, there's wisdom here, and we can see God's heart and these principles here that can speak to us. And especially, like you're saying, that maybe we miss a lot of times all the different places in the Hebrew Scriptures that speak to justice and speak to our commonality and community. And like you said earlier, that we are our brother and sisters keepers. And so I really am thankful that you were able to kind of bring that point out. Well, Bert, just want to thank you so much for taking time to be on the podcast and just just sharing so much wisdom and knowledge with us. Again, Bert is the author of the book Subversive Wisdom, Socio-Political Dimensions of John's Gospel. Also encourage you guys to check out his podcast. Bible study, parody, and subversion in Matthew's gospel. And you can connect with Bert through those mediums. And Bert, just want to thank you so much again for being on the podcast.
Thank you. It was an honor to be here. It was really fun. And maybe we can do this again sometime.
All right, so there it is. I want to thank Bert for bringing his just his wealth of study and knowledge to this question. And for those of you guys out there who ever thought about maybe taking some Bible classes or going to seminary, I think you got a little taste of what seminary might be like today. And so my main takeaways from the conversation are this. One, that we need to remember that the Old Testament was Jesus's Bible. And so if we want to understand Jesus and his ministry and his teaching, it's critical that we understand the Old Testament because that forms the context for the New Testament. Also, that the Old Testament laws were really specifically for the people of Israel living in the land of Israel. And so they don't directly apply to us today. We're not under that law. But what we are under is the wisdom and the truth within those laws. That's what we look for in the Old Testament. And so we're not bound by the laws of Torah. We would do well to gain the wisdom and the insights from Torah to apply to our lives today. And the last take home is that we don't just look at the Old Testament as a book of symbols and prophecies about Jesus, but that we don't want to miss God's heart that is on display in the Old Testament. God's heart for justice and love for our neighbors and love for God, all of which are ultimately fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ and the gospel that he brings. And so again, I want to thank our guest, Bert Newton. You'll find a bio for Bert in the episode description, as well as links to his podcast and his book if you want to connect with him more. And as always, if you guys have any questions or feedback on this episode or really anything else, there's a link in the episode description. And if you'd like to support the podcast, you can buy me a cup of coffee and I'll give you a shout out on the show. All right, I hope you have a great weekend and we'll see you next week. Take care. For more Daily Sabbath content, please be sure to follow us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also follow us on our Instagram account, Daily Sabbath.